Geek Therapy Radio.
I've got Dungeon Master's Guide. I've got 12-sided die. I've got Kitty Pryde and Nightcrawler too, waiting there for me. Yes, I do. I've got posters on the wall. My favorite rock group Kiss. I've got Ace Frehley. I've got Peter Criss waiting there for me. Yes, I do. In the garage, I feel safe. No one cares about my ways. In the garage where I belong, no one hears me sing this song. In the garage.
Welcome to the Geek Therapy Radio Podcast. I'm your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger. Thank you for joining me for the fourth day in a row of the Geek Therapy Radio Podcast, getting back on track here with the 5 podcasts per week schedule. I should mention right now that usually what this would amount to is a podcast Monday through Thursday and Sunday evening, since the new shows each week air on Sunday nights, at least here in Houston, at 6 p.m. on our local radio station, KPRC 950 AM. I release the podcast, usually the routine I've found myself in is releasing the podcast on a scheduled release to release at 7 p.m. Central Time here in the United States, so that immediately when my show goes off the actual airwaves, that broadcast is immediately available as a podcast the moment the show leaves the actual radio electromagnetic radiation antennas here and in Houston. But we'll see. I might go back to a Friday release. The thing is, on Friday, I'm working on the show. There's a lot more to do. There's a lot more production that goes into the broadcast because I have to edit it into specific segments and then put that all together and then upload it here in the system at the radio station. Or if I can't finish it in time while I'm actually at work, then I have to email the segments to the board operator who comes in after me, or another board operator over the weekend to get the Sunday show up. So just letting you know, I guess an easy way to say that, it should be new podcasts Sunday through Thursday. Would be a much better way to say that, but we'll see what kind of schedule that I fit down into. I'm just happy right now that I'm on the 4th podcast of this week. That was the old schedule, 5 podcasts per week, and I'm on number 4 right now, 4 consecutive days. So today, let's just get right into the meat and potatoes. So today I wanted to talk about 2 things that are on my mind right now. RetroArch, which is an video game emulation software, kind of a conglomeration of a bunch of different cores, but we'll get into that in a moment. First, I want to talk about Gallium Nitride, or Gallium Nitride or Gallium Nitrate? Nitride. I don't know why I doubted myself. Gallium Nitride. So you may have been seeing more of this Gallium Nitride hype kind of ramping up again across social media, YouTube, tech outlets. I think I saw Snazzy Labs Quinn mention it on Twitter. I saw another post about it on YouTube, another video uploaded to it on YouTube, and it got me going down a rabbit trail of gallium nitride, because anytime any sort of technology like this gets reinvigorated or rehyped, I try to follow it, at least just to know what's going on with it, because I was thinking gallium nitride, that sounds familiar. And as it turns out, everybody listening to this right now is familiar with gallium nitride. We have used products with gallium nitride in it. Gallium nitride is a semiconductor, just like silicon, and we'll talk about how it's replacing silicon in a second, and the benefits and properties of gallium nitride that make it a benefit over silicon. But gallium nitride in devices that you have already interacted with, Blu-ray players, the blue laser light, blue LEDs, and all sorts of other different electronics have used gallium nitride for years, if not decades. So that RGB, the blue LEDs in your RGB, high likelihood it's gallium nitride. We have interacted with gallium nitride on the consumer level for years. But the big news, the hype right now, and I don't want to call it hype because it's actual benefits. It's not hype like it's not going to go anywhere or do anything. It's actual good hype that will benefit the tech community and electronics as we know it, particularly in energy delivery. That's one of the big fields of exploration and advancement right now with gallium nitride, is that gallium nitride is an order of magnitude more efficient at conducting electricity when it's in its conductive form. Semiconductor is either a conductor or an insulator. It's either on or off. It's binary. So if you have, so is silicon. So let's say in a processor you have silicon. On that, in a transistor, its state is either on or off. It either insulates electricity or it conducts electricity. So you have all these ones and zeros. All binary means is on and off, on and off, on and off. All the transistors in your CPU and your GPU and whatever else is using transistors, it's just on and off functions. So it's a switch. That's basically all it is. It turns out, though, that gallium nitride is much, much more efficient than silicon. And when you get much more efficient, that means you have a lot lower electrical requirements. It means that if gallium nitride is used as in transistor circuits in CPUs and GPUs and whatever else has a central processing unit in it, that means theoretically you can go faster, you can have more calculations per second, and use a whole heck of a lot less energy. It means you run cooler, and when you run cooler, that means you can clock higher. It's very good. Gallium nitride the progress is being made to, I wouldn't say completely replace silicon, at least not anytime in the very near future, but it's starting to wean itself into such devices, and its qualities are very promising for use in transistors, anything that requires a semiconductor. So there are big strides being made, and maybe one day we'll see more gallium nitride based, or maybe completely gallium nitride based, or maybe mostly gallium nitride based central processing units or graphical processing units. It's a very cool future to think about. I did a show, I've done a YouTube video about this, and I've talked about this a few times on Geek Therapy Radio, how Moore's Law has kind of plateaued right now. It's no longer the 18-month doubling of power intervals that we've seen over the past few decades as far as computing power per volume, per square inch is concerned, because yes, we've doubled computing power, but that was a direct result of the core wars. We've gotten down to the 5 to 7 nanometer process thereabouts, and you have, yes, mainstream, 32 core, 64 core Threadrippers, and they're the size of the palm of your hand, basically, the big fat meat part of your hand. It wasn't necessarily that the actual processors got smaller. It's just that to make up for the fact that we're reaching the end of Moore's Law with how small we can make transistors, we've just started adding more cores to processors to keep up. So I've maintained that part of this process to maintain Moore's Law and to keep computers as efficient and growing into the future and more powerful into the future is twofold. One, a transition to a better material to make transistors smaller, pack more transistors, make transistors more efficient, like gallium nitride, and equally, just as importantly, more elegant code and more elegant ways of processing code. Apple is onto this with ARM processors, RISC versus CISC. Reduced instruction set computing, I believe, is what RISC stands for. That's what ARM processors are based on. And then CISC, complex instruction set computing, which is what x86 and x64 processors are based on. So your Intel Core i9s is an x86 CISC-based processor, and your AMD Ryzen 9 3900X is a CISC-based x86 x64 processor, 64-bit processor nowadays, versus ARM processors, which are RISC, reduced instruction set computing processors. And it's just, the way you can kind of think of it, not to get too sidetracked here, the way I think of it at least, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe you have a better analogy for it. But complex instruction set computing, CISC processors like x86 processors, Intel and AMD processors, basically the data is thrown at the CPU, and it's making sense of all the data that's thrown into it all at once. Just this big bulk of data, and the CPU itself is making sense of it and trying to streamline it in a way that it can process it and put it out the other end. It's a complex instruction set processor. Complex instruction set. It's getting complex code, complex instructions, and then the processor is making sense of it. Versus RISC, reduced instruction set computing. I'm going to look that up. Before I say reduced instruction set computing anymore, I'm going to make sure that I'm getting that right before I continue to make an ass of myself. All right, well, I was really, really close, and I don't think many people would fault me. RISC, reduced instruction set computer, and then CISC, complex instruction set computer. So a CISC, or x86 computer, and a complex instruction set thrown at the CPU, and the CPU is going to make sense of it. A big, giant code all at once, effectively, and the computer makes sense of it. Versus RISC, reduced instruction set, means more efficient lines of code are fed to the computer one at a time, very, very fast, but very elegant code. It can work a lot. It can work very quickly. It's a simpler instruction set. Means the CPU doesn't have to stress so much decoding all of it. Not exactly the same way that a complex instruction set is decoded. It's like feeding it much more elegant, much more efficient lines of code, basically. And again, that's a gross oversimplification, and it all amounts to being able to upload a Facebook post. I mean, it's two different ways to effectively do the same thing. And again, gross oversimplification. I do not want to upset any computer programmers out there, but ARM tends to be more efficient. ARM processors based on RISC processing architecture tend to be much more efficient than complex instruction set computers like x86 or x64. So all I'm getting at with that grossly oversimplified crash course, might be riddled with some errors here and there, which I'm sure programmers, here's the email, geektherapy@iheartmedia.com, or just geektherapyradio.com. There's the contact form right there. Or you can get at me on Twitter. We can help clarify. It's all about sharing knowledge and spreading knowledge through Geek Therapy Radio. And I love hearing from you, the audience, to help me in that endeavor. I absolutely adore it. It's a key part of Geek Therapy Radio. Anyways, the reason why I'm bringing this up is that part and parcel to the advancement of Moore's Law, to keep us on track with Moore's Law, I have always thought, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this, that it's a twofold issue. It's not just making the processors more efficient. It's not just reducing the manufacturing process or going from silicon to gallium nitride. It's also that the code has to get much more efficient and much more elegant. I think for a long time, again, I can't speak for programmers because I'm not a programmer, but I've used software. A lot of us have used software, and it seems like there's so much bloat happening in the code. It just feels like it. I can't speak as a programmer because I'm not a programmer, but as a user, it just feels like, wow, this should not be taking so long to compute. It doesn't feel right. It feels, I struggle to call the code lazy, but I'm sure there are some programmers out there who are lazy because programmers are just human beings too, and maybe they're not writing the code as elegantly and efficiently as they can because it'll take a couple extra instruction cycles to get through this code. What's a couple of extra? When you've got 5 gigahertz of instruction cycles to work with, then what's adding 2 or 3 more cycles? I'll just keep this code in here rather than tear my hair out trying to figure out how to make the code better. You've got to figure that happens in programming. And I'm not blaming the programmers for that. I 100% would totally understand that it's a very complex, a very difficult job. And if you've been working on a code for hours, days, months, even years, then getting it good enough to meet a deadline, I 100% not agree with that necessarily, but I can understand it. Get it good enough to meet a deadline. I can wrap my head around that kind of thought process. So, like I said, in addition to getting the actual hardware more efficient, the code and the programming is going to get more efficient as well, and that's equally as important to the actual hardware becoming more efficient. And that brings us all back around to gallium nitride. But I want to switch, I hate this phrase, I want to switch gears a little bit with gallium nitride and talk about its power delivery efficiencies, basically. Basically what it means, researchers think that eventually gallium nitride products, let's talk about chargers and converters and electrical converters and things like that, which is what chargers are, that will see a 1,000% size reduction due to the efficiency of gallium nitride, and that it runs cooler, and that it's a lot smaller, it can transmit electricity a lot more efficiently than silicon and other semiconductors. That essentially you'll have and this is all theoretical. Instead of having a big giant, this is a good example of it. Instead of having a big giant, 100 or 200 watt brick for your laptop, when you plug in your laptop, I don't think there's any laptops. There's not many laptops, especially not gaming laptops, that have the power supplies built into them. Old laptops sometimes had power supplies built into them, but the power supply has been moved to the outside of the laptop. That's why the laptops have big giant bricks, especially big, powerful gaming laptops and workstation laptops have big bricks. That's just what they are. That's what's converting the alternating current coming out of your wall into 19 volts or so, or 22 volts or so of direct current at so many amps going into your laptop. Now picture that big brick. Let's just say it's the size of a brick. If we're talking a scale of reduction in size using gallium nitride and much more efficient, that would turn it into a wall wart like iPods had and iPhones. Just that small little square could pack 200 watts of output and run super cool. That is a very simple way to think of the benefits that gallium nitride circuitry will bring to chargers. So now we're just thinking about laptop chargers. Now let's think about the power grid on the whole. Let's think about power stations and substations and the power converters and down voltage and up voltage and shunt converters and whatever have you. What is it? Shunt conversion? What's the term I'm looking for? Bunt? I got to be careful with my consonants that end in unt. Oh gosh, it's gonna eat me alive. I'm sorry. Just scream it real loud into your car speakers if you're listening to this podcast in your car, or scream it real loud into your ear pods. I might hear you. Better not just email me. Buck converters. Anyways, these conversions. Let's think about a grid. Let's think about a power station. Maybe not in your neighborhood, but we've all driven by power stations, especially, here in the medical center in Houston, near downtown Houston, which is got its hands full right about now, actually. But we'll move on. But there's these power stations, and maybe there's a big power station in your neighborhood. Think about that 100 times smaller. Picture, instead of a power station feeding the entire neighborhood, think about that the size of just the box that's in your backyard. Instead of having all of these giant towers and wires and insulators and all sorts of things taking up a quarter acre, now picture it no bigger than the air conditioning unit outside your house. That's a way better way of putting it. Maybe taking up 3 square feet instead of a half acre or more to take care of all the conversion and voltage regulating coming off the power lines to feed your neighborhood. That's the type of efficiency that gallium nitride promises to bring to electronics, not just semiconductors and transistors inside of a CPU, but in everything, the motherboard, all the circuitry, the power coming from the wall, the converters that you plug into the wall to power that computer, the power supply of your computer. It's miniaturization, it's more efficiency if it's based on gallium nitride, and that's the promise of gallium nitride. I will leave a link in the podcast description. I promise. I am pinching myself to remember. I will put a link in the podcast description to get you started on your discovery of gallium nitride. I'm going to leave an Engadget post that I think does a good job of bringing readers kind of up to speed. It's not going to be this big, giant, in-depth scientific article, but it will bring you up to speed, and it will send you on your way to read the more in-depth articles. Gallium nitride, there's Wikipedia entries, of course. It's pretty interesting when you think about it. And it's beyond my scope. I'm not a professional electrician or programmer or circuit designer. I can't begin to describe the molecular qualities, the physics involved in gallium nitride, but I'll include a link in the podcast description to send you on your way. And I will do the same thing. I have been doing the same thing. I've been reading all these things, all these terms and things that are going over my head. It's not in my wheelhouse, so to speak, but it's very fun to read about and be educated about. So gallium nitride, that's really cool. It's really cool stuff. I can't wait for that future. We've been talking about, what comes to mind first in replacement for silicon and replacement for electronic components and chemistry of electronics. We have been and still are to some degree talking about carbon-based, carbon nanotubes and such. I think the issue with carbon nanotubes specifically is that it's very brittle, as what I understand. It's very strong, but when you're talking about on a scale of miniaturization, it's tougher to get a hold of. It's a tougher technology to work with. It's a tougher substance to work with, from what I gather, just being a layperson with all this, than with gallium nitride. But who knows? It's good. If there's competing technologies, that's good. But we'll get there first. Carbon technology or gallium nitride technology. It's all great. It's all fascinating. So anyways, I want to move on from there to something, well, maybe not a little more fun, but yeah, a little more fun than gallium nitride. Have you ever played with gallium, by the way? Not to get too sidetracked. Gallium that melts at room temperature. Gallium melts, at 85 degrees, 80-ish degrees Fahrenheit, thereabouts. What would that be in Celsius? 20 degrees, something, thereabouts Celsius. You put gallium, pure gallium, in your hand and it melts, and it kind of looks like mercury, except it's way safer than mercury. I don't think you'd want to lick gallium. I've had gallium. I used to keep gallium in my freezer because once it's, below body temperature, it's a solid. It's really cool. So I keep it in my freezer. The only thing about playing with gallium is it makes your hands absolutely filthy. Your hands get filthy almost exactly like, picture drawing something on a piece of paper with a number 2 pencil, just rubbing that paper with the number 2 pencil and then rubbing the palm of your hand on that paper, and you pull your hand up and it's all sooty with the graphite from the number 2 pencil. That's what your hands look like after you play with gallium. So it's very cool, but it becomes very messy. You've seen, maybe some of you can't picture gallium in your head right now. You've probably seen, I don't know, little videos, or you might have seen it on TV, or you might have seen GIFs of it. I wouldn't call it a meme, but you may have seen across the internet or TV that people make spoons and forks and like silverware out of gallium, and they put the spoon down into the warm water, and it just disintegrates into the water. So you've seen gallium, whether or not you know what I'm talking about specifically right now. And you can get gallium. You can buy gallium, at least here in the United States. It's not as toxic as mercury, but I wouldn't, again, want to eat it. But anyways, fun with gallium. So that sidetrack out of the way. RetroArch. Somewhat more fun video gamey tangent to go on here, except it's not a tangent. It's part of the meat and potatoes. This is the potatoes part of the meat and potatoes. I've been dabbling with RetroArch. RetroArch has been around for several years. RetroArch is basically a centralized application that kind of keeps all of your emulators in one place. So let's say you play Nintendo ROMs, Game Boy ROMs, PSP ROMs, Sega Genesis ROMs, Game Gear ROMs, Master System ROMs, MAME arcade ROMs, arcade machines, PlayStation 2, Commodore 64, Commodore VIC-20, Commodore PET, There's all sorts of emulators. Atari, even the Atari ST, Macintosh, all sorts of emulators. But instead of having a bunch of separate programs and a bunch of separate folders around your system, they can all be contained in one software program called RetroArch. So all you got to do is load your cores, download your cores. I'll get to that in a second, and then have it point to all your ROMs, and then you can play all your favorite games. You can instantly go from playing a Game Gear game to playing a PlayStation 2 game, then go from PlayStation 2 to an N64 game, all within the same software with the same application. So that's what I've been tinkering with over the past couple days, and what has led me down this geeky rabbit trail has been my working with the Raspberry Pi, which is based on Linux, and RetroArch is very popular on the Raspberry Pi, works very well on the Raspberry Pi in various forms. RetroPie is the most common form of RetroArch. For Raspberry Pis, there's also Laka, which I believe is also based on RetroArch. It's all based on RetroArch. You can skin RetroArch however you want it to look for your tastes. RetroPie is the most famous on the Raspberry Pi. But at the core of it is RetroArch, and that's what I've been geeking out about for the past few days. I've put RetroArch on my Linux computer, that old Asus EPC 1215N. I also have RetroArch on my main laptop, the MSI GS43 VR, and some other computers just around the house. So I've always known about RetroArch, but I've never really dabbled with RetroArch. I've always had separate emulators. And I'll say one benefit of separate emulators, and again, this is probably because I haven't dug too deep into RetroArch yet, is that it's much easier to control very specific attributes when you're running an individual emulator. Let's say you open JNES or you open Messen and you want to play your Nintendo ROMs. You have easier control over things like resolution and frame skipping and whatever using an individual emulator versus trying to get all that through the core using RetroArch. And a core is the emulator. So a core would be JNES or Messen. A core would be PPSS-PP. Those are the cores that you load into and download into RetroArch, and it's very easy. And that's really what I wanted to talk about when bringing up RetroArch, is that it's fairly easy to set up. I think at the beginning it looks kind of intimidating because you're talking about cores and ROMs and ISOs and all sorts of things, but RetroArch is really easy to get. You just Google RetroArch and go to their website and download it for your particular operating system, whether it's Linux, whether it's Mac, even iOS. There's a complicated rigmarole way to do it on a non-jailbroken iOS device. I haven't even messed with that. I don't care. Android devices, RetroArch is available for basically everything and can run on basically everything. Single SBC, single board computers, all sorts of stuff. So just Google RetroArch, RetroArch, and download RetroArch for your system. Now, you'll be greeted with the screen, and I know a podcast isn't the perfect way to, do a tutorial RetroArch, but this is really easy. I think it'll be just fine for a podcast. And if anything, just go to YouTube and just type in RetroArch. It'll help you set up. There's millions of videos to help you get going with RetroArch. But at the very basically, here's how you get started. Download RetroArch, open RetroArch, and you'll see on the main menu display, it'll say Load Core. It's right there at the top. It's basically saying, what system do you want to load in here to play? Even though if you open a ROM, it'll automatically find the core for you if you have the core downloaded. So all I'm getting at here is downloading cores. It's very simple. Just click on Load Core, and then you scroll down to where it says like Download Cores. And then you're going to see dozens of cores that you can download. You're going to see Amiga, NES, Game Gear, Sega Genesis, Master System, Mega Drive, Arcade, MAME, SNES, NES, Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, PlayStation, PlayStation 2, PlayStation Portable. You're going to see it all there. And you just click on it or hit enter on it or double click on it, and it automatically downloads the cores for you. It is super simple in that way. So now you have all the cores. So let's say you've downloaded a core for NES. You've downloaded Messen or Simple NES or Quick NES or whatever. There's a few different cores for each system, for each emulator. Just get the cores super fast, super easy, super free. And now you need to find ROMs. And will keep any... man, I'm so scared to say this. Google's your friend. Just type in Nintendo ROMs, and it's your friend. I hope Nintendo doesn't hear this and flag this. I will do a little caveat, the little gray area here. Don't download ROMs that you don't already own. So I'm going to say this for the microphone. For anyone listening to me right now, I'm definitely not putting my finger on my nose. Definitely not. This is only audio. Don't download a Super Mario Brothers ROM unless you own the actual Super Mario Brothers cartridge. And even that is a gray area. There are no shortage of ways to come across ROMs, matey. Just get the ROMs, get the ISOs of games that you already own, put them in a folder, point RetroArch to that folder when you load contents, aka load a game, and you're off and running with RetroArch. It's super easy. It's a super easy way to... I think it's a super easy way to dip your toes into emulation, because I was trying to change this. I know how to change the scaling, but it was harder to. It's more rigmarole to change individual resolution settings for each core. I'm sure that it's possible, but it's just what I'm dabbling with right now. And let's say I want to run Yoshi's Island on Super Nintendo at a custom resolution. I mean, yes, you can. It's kind of a roundabout way to do it, and it's not the same for every core. It's individual for every core. But if you just leave everything stock, don't mess with all that advanced setting stuff, and just you've downloaded your core for Super Nintendo, you have your ROM of Yoshi's Island that you legally own the cartridge to, and you load that content into the core, and you're off and away playing. It's easy in that way using default settings, but it can get more complicated once you get into deeper. That being said, it's also really cool. One of the coolest things that I haven't messed with, but it's cool that it's there, and it just got me thinking about my arcade units. I have, for those who don't know, I have a Konami cabinet that I've converted into a MAME cabinet, basically. I have a Core i5 and a GTX 750 Ti up in there, and I play arcade games on this arcade unit. I've got a X-Arcade tank stick. It is the most favorite thing that I've ever built in my entire life. It's my most favorite tinker that I've ever done in my entire life, my arcade machine. So the way I got my arcade machine running, and this is what I'm getting to with the RetroArch, and something cool you can do with RetroArch, is right now I have I want to say it's a 23-inch TN panel. It's not IPS because the viewing angles are not great. But it's a flat screen 16:9, just LCD computer monitor in there, behind the glass of the arcade unit itself. One of the cool things I see in the options of RetroArch under video output is that you have a supreme amount of control but in terms of altering frame rates and altering output resolutions to match CRT monitors. And that's got me thinking. It's a specific section for CRTs because RetroArch knows that a lot of people are going to make arcade cabinets, MAME machines out of, Raspberry Pis or single board computers or even mini ITX computers, what have you. They know that, hey, some RetroArch enthusiasts, emulation enthusiasts, are probably going to have this installed in an arcade cabinet, and they're probably going to go all the way with a CRT in there. And that gives me so they have the options available in RetroArch to output perfect signal to whatever CRT you may be using. So that got me thinking with my arcade cabinet, my MAME machine, that, you know what? I may be visiting local electronic recyclers here around Houston and looking for a CRT monitor that will fit perfectly in the arcade machine cabinet. I do have a 17-inch CRT on my desk that I use. It's hooked up to my main workstation. It's hooked up to my 3900X workstation. I've got the 17-inch CRT monitor, which max resolution is like 1024 by 800 or something like that. 800 by 1024. It's 1024 maximum resolution. But I've got it running off of my GTX 980. So it's overkill for that CRT, but it's as a dual monitor. It's set up as an alternative screen so that I can drag down my RetroArch, games that I'm playing and play it on an actual CRT in all its full glory without using a shader. You can use a shader on your 16 by 9 LCD panel, your IPS display, use a shader to make it look like a phosphorus LCD display, or like it's running off a composite or RGB or S-video or whatever coming out of the back of a Super Nintendo component. You can use shaders to make it look like anything. Up into it even emulates the curvature of a display. It's really cool. But nothing beats the real thing. So, and I know it's a stretch to say the real thing when you're talking about emulation, but it's closer to the real thing when you're running that emulator on an actual CRT. And I run my emulation a lot of times on my actual 17-inch CRT. But that 17-inch diagonally measured CRT, it's pretty small inside of the arcade machine. So I would need, 19-inch maybe? I would have to do some research. I would have to do some measurements to find what kind of computer CRT would best fit into that arcade machine. There are still manufacturers for dedicated arcade CRTs, just the tubes and it doesn't come in a plastic shell or anything. It's just a frame, and you mount up the frame inside your cabinet, and you can mount the CRT right to it. They're very expensive. It's way cheaper to go to your local electronics recycler and get a computer CRT, get a Dell whatever CRT, get a Holy Grail Sony Vega whatever CRT, and put that into your cabinet. Although I take it back on the Sony Vega CRTs; those are at a friggin' premium. But find a CRT that came with a Dell Optiplex, or a CRT that came with a Gateway computer, CRT that came with a Hewlett Packard or a Compaq computer, and use that to run your emulators on as a secondary display to run emulation through. It is glorious. Glorious. What was that? It's so fun. It is, since you're using an emulator, it's not 100% authentic like firing up your actual NES. But playing a game through an emulator, but on an actual CRT, it's just wonderful. Just wonderful. So I think that's where I'm going to wrap up this podcast. Oh my goodness, only 35 minutes today. What's wrong with me? Well, plus the bump music. And if you haven't noticed, when I do these daily podcasts that I don't intend to upload to YouTube for obvious reasons, I like to choose what bump music I use, and I like to play the entirety of it out. So I'll find a good place for the intro bump music to come in, but usually on the outro, I pick up right where I came in, so you don't miss any of the song. And there might be some people out there who appreciate that. Yesterday, I did Voodoo Chow, cover by Stevie Ray Vaughan. Oh, sometimes I go in these moods, and I want to play some blues, and you might hear me play some blues or some heavy rock or some metalized versions of video game music or vaporwave versions of old country road or whatever. So I like to use different music, but I like to play it in its entirety for my podcast listeners. You are worthy of love. Speaking of bump music, you are worthy of love, both giving and receiving love, and you are worthy of your own self-respect. Please embrace your inner geek. Find your geek thing, re-embrace your geek thing, an old hobby, old passion of yours, a new hobby, new passion of yours. Maybe you want to get into RetroArch. Maybe you want to start researching gallium nitride. That's what I'm here for on Geek Therapy Radio. But also don't be afraid to reach out to me to correct me on anything or steer me in the right direction on anything. GeekTherapyRadio.com is the easiest way just to write down what's the word I'm looking for? Just in the form right there. I kept wanting to say forum. The contact form right there on GeekTherapyRadio.com. While you're at it, there is merch. There is links to past podcasts on there. But just go to GeekTherapyRadio.com and you'll be all set. And I guess that's it. I think I'm probably not going to upload another podcast until Sunday night. So I hope you enjoyed. I hope you guys and girls have a great weekend. Embrace your geek thing. Be safe. Wear those masks when you're going outside into the public. Just be safe. I love you all. Talk to you all soon. Take care.